Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it is indeed a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your time. I have equal respect for your executive director and for the work of this agency, and is well known nationally. And I also have respect for the work that each of you do. I've worked for elected officials for my 30-some-year career, and I know what you do. I know the impact you make on a local community level, and for you to take time away from your professions, your local elected offices, the dozens of other T-shirts that you wear, to come downtown and make decisions together. I appreciate the commitment that you're bringing to the future of this community. I did grow up in California. I'm a product. I grew up in Southern California mostly, but I've lived all over the state. I am a product of the University of California system. Proposition 13 passed. I think all of you remember that. And there was no career in public service. So I went to Kansas City for a year to take an internship, thinking I would be back. And then life and love took over, to be honest with you. So here I am, 30-some years later. I have spent my entire career in local government and at the Mid-America Regional Council. What I thought I would do today with the time that I've got is to give you sort of a quick walkthrough of what we do. Not to sell it to you, but just to communicate to you what it is we do and the range of things that we're involved in. Then secondly, I would like to step back from that and kind of talk about how we got to this place and how we took on the personality and the functions that we did. And then as time permits, I'd like to drill down specifically in a couple of areas where I think you may have some interest, or if you want to focus my attention on something, I'd be happy to do that as well. And as Mike said, please interrupt, just raise your hand if I'm going too fast. I have a lot to say, and so my strategy, frankly, is just to talk fast. So I'll try and get through this in pretty short order. Mark has indicated in the materials in front of you is the Association of Local Governments in the Metropolitan Planning Area for the Kansas City region. We were formed in 1972 as a result of a merger between sort of a loose collection of local governments and a federally driven planning agency called MetroPlan. We were created, I gather like you are, by intergovernmental agreement. In our case, the 9 counties, 5 in Missouri and 4 in Kansas, and the 6 largest cities make up the corporate infrastructure of MARC, and then we have representatives from all of the other municipalities in the metropolitan area. I think you all know these groups exist all over the country, and we all have our particular strengths. I think SACOG is most noted for your innovation in planning. Your blueprint work is common knowledge in the field. Your urban-rural connections work is extraordinary. I think what we are noted for is sort of the breadth of responsibilities and roles that we play. We have a wider range of functions and roles and services than many of our counterparts across the country. And as a result of that, have a pretty high level of visibility, a pretty tight connection with our local government leadership in our region. It is a very complicated region. We're similar in size to Sacramento. We're 2 million people. In our case, 119 cities and towns, 9 counties, 2 states, countless special districts. I think we have 64 school districts, 4,400 square miles. It's a big and complicated place. There are lots of bi-state and tri-state areas in America. I think you all know that. I think what characterizes our dynamics is that the population and job base is so evenly split across the state line. It's about 40% in Kansas, 60% in Missouri. It's kind of tilting over time on the Kansas side. And so we've got to come together. Neither side dominates, and in order for us to move forward, we've both got to come together. I would say that state line politics, state line dynamics are sort of the pervading sort of undercurrent of what gets in the way of progress in our particular metropolitan area. I think the other thing that's really interesting about our state line is that it's essentially a residential street. In fact, your chairman lived about a mile away from a residential street that divides Kansas and Missouri. And so there's a very tight social and economic network that crosses seamlessly through the urbanized area every single day, yet there's a highly fractured political network that makes it really hard to bring all of these communities together. We're governed by a 33-member board of all elected officials. It looks very similar to the collection of people gathered around this table. They are all named by their respective jurisdictions, either by a loose formula that sort of approximates population, or the smaller cities, mayors come together and appoint one of themselves to be their representative or their alternate. The work of our organization is carried out through an extensive network of committees, not unlike here, In our case, we have dozens, literally dozens of committees that work on specific issues. They bring together federal officials, state officials, local government officials, lots of professionals, lots of other elected officials who don't necessarily serve on our board, and lots of not-for-profit business and civic leaders. And so it all depends on the issue is how we gather people together. Some of our committees are highly structured with bylaws and representation formulas, particularly those that allocate money or make sort of semi-governmental decisions, but many are sort of loose and open and ad hoc, depending upon kind of the nature of the work that's ahead of the group. Our mission is to advance regional progress through what we refer to as leadership, planning, and action. These are very similar kinds of roles that you play, trying to serve as a problem-solving forum, coordinating policies and plans, and helping to provide a host of services and help the community act on those plans. We are funded in a pretty eclectic way. We are a big agency, but actually we're a lot of little agencies. We have this year a $60 million budget. It's been as high as $75 million, and only about $500,000 of that is flexible. The rest of it is all categorical, raised to accomplish one specific issue or another. So there's a lot of sort of complexity to our financial and administrative affairs. About 80% of that comes from grants, and that includes state and local contributions. And so grants is a pretty big concept. It's not just federal grants. And about 12 to 15% of that is kind of the value of in-kind services. So we actually have about $50 million coming in cash, and the other 5% is in fees. To look at it in a different way, I would say that right now, it varies every year, but right now about 75% of the money that comes through our agency originates at the federal government, and about 15 to 20% comes from local governments, and the other comes from philanthropy or fees or other kinds of revenue streams. I would also say that of every dollar we bring in, about $3 of it goes right back out the door to local governments or community agencies to do one service or another. So if we gain $1, the region gains 3, and likewise if we downsize. We get into and out of a lot of things, depending upon the needs and priorities of the community, depending upon opportunities to seek funding support, depending upon whether there's leadership and interest. The areas that we work on are sort of highlighted in the slides in front of you. Like you, we serve as a metropolitan planning organization, and we do a lot of work in transportation, all of the traditional functions of long-range planning and allocating funds and doing a particular modal work. We're very heavily involved in intermodal activities. We're a major rail center. Your previous conversation was just fascinating to me because we have very similar issues. UP has a big presence in town. In fact, we're helping half a dozen cities acquire some underutilized right-of-way for trail purposes, and I think we have met the other 599 vice presidents. That has been a very long and arduous discussion. This, I think, is finally coming to fruition. We also do a lot of technical studies, as you do. Some of our operations include a signal coordination system. We coordinate and manage something we call Operation Greenlight through a traffic control center that is outside of our main office. And we right now are connecting, I think we're up to about 800 intersections that are wired together, and we use to coordinate traffic flow along major arterials across multiple jurisdictions. Has enormous air quality, transportation, fuel, time savings to doing that kind of coordination. And then we're also able to override the system in a case of an emergency to help with response situations. We run a regional rideshare program. We're very effective at bringing the region together to go after funding opportunities. We had a $50 million regional Tiger grant that brought transit investments into half a dozen jurisdictions around the metropolitan area. We are very focused on environmental issues. We have a lot of natural resource planning. We help to conceptualize and shepherd the creation of a metropolitan greenway system that now has some 300 miles across the metropolitan area. We manage a solid waste management district. These are funds that come in from the state of Missouri from a tipping fee, and we then use that to allocate and invest in alternative waste reduction strategies that are run by a variety of local governments and community groups. We help to develop the region's strategy around air quality compliance and conform that, as you do here, with our transportation planning processes. We We're involved in stormwater, do a lot of sort of watershed planning in specific watersheds where there's interest. We help to bring the community together to address big issues. For instance, this is a very typical role we might play. We've brought together 2 state highway departments, a couple of utility companies, several railroads, some dredging companies, and about 12 city governments to form a consortium, and then we're serving under an umbrella. We're sort of serving as the local partner with the Corps of Engineers in dealing with a big issue in our region, which is the degradation of the Missouri riverbed through the Kansas City area that's scouring out and creating lots of infrastructure and water quality problems. And so that's a kind of a role that we would play, as sort of bringing together broad coalitions of interest and then sort of serving as the vehicle for communicating with the federal or other partner to solve a particular problem. We do a lot of emergency response work. We run the region's 911 system. That's a role that's evolved over time from simply paying bills to now we maintain and own and operate the equipment in 43 answer points around the region, and we're helping to work on consolidating some dispatcher centers that are run by various local governments and do a lot of public education. We've helped to manage all of the homeland security resources that have come into the region over the last decade or more, about $70 million. It's been a real effective use of local leadership coming together and really building up some capacity that did not exist prior to those resources. We're responsible for coordinating and tracking and managing hazardous materials that come through the region, which is germane to the previous conversation, and just do a lot of different kinds of emergency. Another role that's probably of interest to you is that we bring together all of the ambulance companies and service providers, some of which are public, some of which are not, and have knit together a system that helps them better coordinate their services, to mass buy ambulance supplies, to develop common protocols in response to emergencies. They've developed a common way for intervening quickly in stroke victims so that we have a sort of uniform response to stroke victims. They have a diversion strategy so that if one of the major hospitals can't take a patient, they can en route divert them to the next available emergency bed. And those kinds of coordinating strategies that have come out of that work for a long period of time. We work a lot in social services. We, for 20 years or more, have been helping to drive the improvement of access and quality in early education. That then led to the administration of a Head Start grant that serves 3 counties in our region and some 2,700 families. We serve as the area agency on aging, which allocates federal and state resources for older adult services, and that in turn has morphed into an initiative that some foundations have asked us to lead, to bring the community together to articulate and pursue a strategy for responding to the rapidly changing demographics in all of our communities for older adults. This is an area where the first suburbs are particularly active. A lot of our older suburbs are aging and yet want to regreen. They want to be friendly and supportive and allow their older population to stay in their communities, yet they want to stay younger. So we call it communities for all aging, and our first suburbs are really leading the strategy for how we design services and facilities and infrastructure and walkability plans that help communities stay fresh in response to different demographics. We're working on some interesting work in coordinating safety net clinics around access to health care, and we're also bringing the region together in a pretty, I think, thoughtful strategy around improving our collective response to homelessness, which is a problem in every metropolitan area. We work a lot on land use and placemaking. We were a grantee for the HUD initiative and have developed and pursue a pretty coherent corridor and center strategy for growth in our metropolitan area, focusing a lot on transit services along those corridors. The 19 communities that were sort of developed in the 50s and 60s, the first suburbs of Kansas City, have come together in a coalition and are doing some pretty interesting work. They've been working for 10 years now. I would say the elected leaders in our region really drive that initiative, everything from mortgage stabilization to coming up with idea books on how people can reinvest in homes that may not have the amenities that the modern market wants, and how with a little bit of money you can keep a home fresh and relevant to a different kind of market segment, to working on energy codes that are appropriate for an older suburban context. We've done a couple of commercial redevelopment plans. So there's just sort of a range of specific initiatives that have come out of these coalitions. We work a lot on helping local governments be effective at the local level through joint advocacy. We have a training institute that touches about 8,000 to 10,000 local government leaders every year on everything from policy level issues down to computer classes and building code inspections and a variety of technical training that's been done in a very cost-effective and high-quality way. And then we have more recently really broadened our long-term role, in which I'll talk about a little bit if we have time, in analyzing the regional economy to broaden out our ability to intervene in strategic ways around advancing the ability of our region to remain economically competitive and viable in a really shifting circumstance. So that was a lot. I know I talked fast, but so you can maybe just I really just wanted you to just not necessarily remember any single program, but just to kind of communicate kind of the range of roles and the range of issues that we're engaged in. I will say, even though we're doing a lot, we are not unlike most metropolitan areas. We have our issues, we have our dirty laundry, and since I'm being taped, I'm going to have to say that simply because it's a complicated region, and we don't always get along. In fact, there's this narrative, I think, around our state line, and particularly around economic competition, that undermines our ability to bring our community together in cohesive ways. When I compare our work as an agency and as a region across America, sort of my sense is what we do well is that we're really good at this bread and butter stuff that I just blew through. This sort of day-to-day, in the trenches, behind the scene, intergovernmental coordination, where local leaders are coming together and saying, we want to do something together. Oftentimes it'll involve the not-for-profit or business sector because of the nature of the issue. It's really driven by their ability to use their relationships and our capacity to move forward on a sort of a cooperative, value-added intervention. I think the other thing we do pretty well as a region is we have really great civic capacity. Corporate leaders and foundations who really commit their time and energy and leadership to our community, and they work well together. We have some very significant regional agencies, our Chamber of Commerce, we have a regional economic development marketing agency, a regional group of CEOs that's called the Civic Council. We've got a great United Way, we've got a great regional community foundation. We're a strong organization, and all of us know each other, we work together, we collaborate with each other, at least publicly. Sometimes that doesn't happen as seamlessly behind the scenes, but we have a really good track record and a really high respect for the role that each one of us play. And so at that level, we've got a really, I think, cohesive civic infrastructure that is a benefit to our region. I think where we fall short is we have had a very difficult time sort of making the big bets on our region. We've had a really hard time building a transit system. We're way behind. Well, the streetcar's coming, but it is way behind. We are decades behind America on investing in alternative transit. Or the big bets around really investing in what will grow our economy. We spend a lot of time and money, simply we throw a lot of public dollars to move companies across the state line, literally across the street sometimes. And I could give you some hair-raising numbers. Nobody likes it. When we have our meeting like this, all of you sit around and complain about it, but nobody has sort of found a way to unravel that really difficult problem. And then we have social issues. We have some huge issues of racial disparity and economic disparity that have left a good portion of our population isolated and cut out of access to opportunity. And so those are the things that define a region. The cooperation is really important. I'm proud of it. It makes a difference. It brings values to citizens. The civic leadership has made a lot of huge advances in the region. Yet we still, I think, have a lot of work to do as we use that sort of capacity to then sort of make the big bets and the big investments that will really drive the future of the region. What I'd like to do is maybe step back from that, and I need, Madam Chairman, to ask, kind of get the time check. I wanted to kind of step back and talk a little bit more, reflect just sort of what got us to this place and how we operate, but I also don't want to disrupt the flow of your time. And do you want me to just keep going, or you tell me?
When will we break for lunch?
Pardon?
When will we break?
Well, our agendas don't ever have a hard stop. We had said 11, so people may have personal calendars where they're not able to stay for lunch and need to go at 11. I do think so it's really your pleasure. It's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I think I guess my 2 cents would be if David could continue with a few more minutes of prepared remarks, and if some people need to leave, they just need to leave. He'll understand that. He works for a board too. And then, you know, maybe in 10 minutes or so, then we could take a breath and move. Is that okay?
That sounds good.
Okay.
Well, let me just kind of step back and sort of tell at least my version of the story of why we got to this place of sort of this platform where the region engages and comes together and does a variety of things, and we're able to respond to that. I think our history sort of happens sort of in kind of 3 waves. In the 1970s, when we were formed, we were largely driven by a federal planning agenda, as most regional councils were. There was a ton of regional planning money that came out of Washington, and we were all responding to it on everything from hospitals to land use to housing to infrastructure. And it was during that time, I think, that we built up sort of the standards of professionalism and this sort of stance of neutrality and this role of bringing different levels of government together. It was kind of, that was sort of the foundation that we worked from. But then almost overnight in the late 70s and then into the 80s, that money evaporated, and there was just really pretty much down to transportation, and all of the other federal investments in regional concepts went away. And regional councils across the country did sort of one of 2 things, or somewhere in the middle. They either just honed in on transportation and pretty much became MPOs, no matter how they were structured, and others sort of then kept those sort of traditional roles, but also then turned to their local governments and said, sort of, how can we be a platform to bring value to you through cooperation? And we were one of the latter ones who started listening and engaging more proactively and more intentionally with our local leadership and saying, how can we respond to the agenda that you created? And then a couple of things happened. We lost an Air Force base. We had a huge disaster in the hotel. Some of you may remember where Skywalk collapsed, and overnight every hospital bed and every ambulance was engaged in a way they had never been engaged all across the metropolitan area. About the same time, we had a heat wave that called on this huge regional response that nobody was ready for. And it was sort of out of that crisis, really, that shared challenge, that the local leadership, elected officials, public safety officials, city managers, and others kind of said, you know, we've got some work to do in building up some infrastructure so that we can work together in responding to the common challenges that we all have. And it was during that period of time, I think, as an agency, we became good at building consensus, at really solidifying the value relationship with local leadership, and moving to a variety of revenue streams that would allow us to bring resources in different kinds of ways to support our cooperative efforts. And then as we moved into the 1990s, and there was sort of a rise of understanding that we are a single regional economy, and there was more confidence in the work of the agency, and local governments had more confidence in this idea of working with one another, is really when many of the things that I talked about sort of took off. And we began to be asked and called upon by the community to take on more and more assignments because there was some value in that process. So kind of stepping back from that, I think what has really driven our evolution has been, first and foremost, has been necessity, you know, which is the mother of all invention. There was a need there. There's a shared opportunity, a shared challenge. And sometimes it was just that federal money was available, but other times it was because there were the local leaders or civic community said we need to go there. We have a very complicated region, and by default almost, we became a vehicle by which things could get done. I think secondly, I think what has made a difference is sort of the approach that we've taken to problem solving. I sort of say that I've learned over the years 3 things really matter in this work, and one of which is leadership. We don't do anything that somebody else doesn't want us to do. We don't do anything unless a point of leadership comes from around the region to sort of step forward. And it's not just somebody saying take that hill. It's people like you who understand how to work together, understand how to problem solve together. They engage people. It's this particular style of leadership, and we have helped to cultivate an environment in which that style of leadership can flourish and emerge. I think the second thing, and you will all understand this, that really matters in this work is process matters. None of this work happens just by accident or happens just by coming around the table. There has to be methodical processes. The change process really almost needs to be engineered in a way so that you're dealing with issues sort of in a sequential way, and getting out the facts, getting the right people at the table, developing a neutral platform, identifying your principles early. And there's some very intentional things that we strive to do and have gotten better at over the years that enable us to be effective when we work on one problem or another, because we think about how the process should work to get an outcome. And that's the third thing that sort of really matters in this work, is that results matter. The objective is not to collaborate, it's not to plan. The objective is to make a difference in the towns that we all represent and are here to serve in the lives of people that live here. And so we are very intentional and have demonstrated our ability over time to get stuff done, to get something out the door that makes a difference in people's lives or on the ground. And so that sort of results focus, that process focus, and that leadership focus create sort of an environment in which you can build trust, and that's really the glue that pulls us together, trust across institutions, across jurisdictions, and it's that trust that then I think has enabled us to sort of move forward. I would say that we also have a very nimble, flexible culture within our organization. We're able to respond and shift very quickly, and that has a lot to do with how we manage our internal affairs and the kind of people we hire. Our roles vary greatly. Sometimes we are sort of the backbone that brings everybody together. Other times we're the transportation expertise that's coming to a table that somebody else is setting and kind of taking the lead on. The funding work stream varies in all of this work. At the end of the day, there aren't that many places to get money. You get it from grants, you get it from fees, you get it from passing the hat, or you get it from corporate underwriting, and we do all of it. And I can talk more about that maybe in the workshop about how we go about doing some of that kind of stuff. And then I would say finally, and I think I'm going to stop here just in the interest of time, we get presented with a lot of issues. They come from lots of places. I think federal and state leaders and opportunities and state laws sometimes are a major source of leadership. Our elected leaders, either who are on the board or not on the board, often bring ideas forward. Our work in first suburbs, as I said, came entirely out of the work of mayors. Most of our work comes from professional staff. Public works and fire guys are particularly prolific. I think it's partly because they have a kind of shared underpinning of professional strategy and outlook that allows them to sort of come to the table and more quickly move an issue forward. And so they bring a lot of the ideas. Our Operation Greenlight system was because a couple of our public works directors, one on either side of the state line, knew that they did this in Clark County, Nevada, and they said, we want to do that here. And they came downtown and said, let's figure out how to move this idea forward. And it took a few years, but it got done. And then oftentimes it comes, our work, especially in human services, comes from civic sectors, where a community process will get underway, it will get so far, and they'll come to us and ask us to lead implementation or to carry it the next step. I mean, our work in homelessness began with a task force at the Bar Association. They took it to the mayor's office. The mayor said, homelessness isn't just our problem. He started inviting other cities into it. They published a 300-page report. It was brilliant. And then they said, well, what are we going to do next? And so they kind of brought it across the street, and we were involved in some of this work and said, help us lead this work forward. And so we've helped to raise some philanthropic resources and keep the committees and processes together to move that agenda forward. And so when we get presented with these things, we have sort of a choice to make. Do we do it or not? And we don't have a formal mechanism for doing this, but at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to 3 or 4 considerations. The first of which is whether we're wanted. We tend not to go to places where we're not wanted, and unless there's sort of some external request, it's really hard to sort of put an idea out there for which there's no market or interest. I think second, we sort of ask ourselves, can we make a difference? Is this something that we really can do something about, or are we just doing this for show? And we are not about make work, and so it's if we can't make a difference, we tend to sort of pull away or find that out earlier. We obviously ask typical questions of fit, whether it's compatible with our mission and our goals, and whether it's multi-jurisdictional. We tend not to add value if there's just 2 cities or governments involved. We add value if there's 3 or more. Otherwise, those 2 can just sort of work together, but we bring value as a neutral platform if there's sort of 3 or more parties that need to come together around the issue, whether it's consistent with local government expectations. And then finally, we need to make sure there's a business model that will support the work over time. And that's probably the question we answer least effectively. Sometimes we get into things that are clearly loss leaders and they don't get very far. We have to adjust expectations, or we have to grow them over time into being something that's more meaningful and impact. I would say what's common to everything that we do is there's always a place of oversight. Everything that I talked about has a group that we work in support of. We're the platform that other people come together to do what they want to do in a collective kind of way. I think my experience with local governments over time, I used to be a city manager, is that at the end of the day, a local government really wants to retain the ability to be responsive to its own citizen base. And so if it's sharing a service or sharing a problem, you've got to maintain the ability to respond to the people that call you at midnight, and I've gotten those calls. I think secondly, local governments really want to retain policy control. They want to drive the destiny of their communities. At the end of the day, that's why we form local governments, is sort of to drive the destiny of this place we care about, and they do not want to let go of that, and that's by virtue of why they exist. And I think third, they want adaptability, they want flexibility. They want to be, they don't want to marry a regional process, but they want to participate in it, and if it's not meeting their needs, they want to renegotiate the terms of engagement over time. And so those issues of responsiveness and policy control and flexibility are sort of embedded in all of the work that I just mentioned. None of these are sort of binding contracts or commitments. They're all voluntary, and there is always an oversight mechanism in which the local leadership sort of drives the agenda, and then we're supporting the response to that. I think in a similar vein, what's common to all of our work is that it represents a coalition of willing partners. We do little we do nothing, I would say, that sort of compels people to engage. The closest that we get to it is our MPO work, and you know that world. There's sort of you have to play at this table in order to receive resources. But other than that, everything else is a matter of organizations, local governments, community groups deciding to come together. And then in a similar vein, but this is really a point worth making, and I'll end on, is that there really, as almost always in these issues, sort of somebody outside of our agency that's driving the change. We are much more effective when we have a mayor, we have a city council member, we have a county commissioner, we have a business leader, we have a couple of public works directors, a couple of fire chiefs who really are passionate about getting something done. And it is their sort of ability to articulate the vision for what they're striving to get done that we then support and build processes around and build systems around so that they can be effective over time. And so I'm going to end there. I was going to, and maybe at lunch we can talk a little bit about some of our specific work around the economy or around first suburbs or any other issues that you're particularly interested in. But let me just end there, and we can take the break, Madam Chairman, and we'll
Thank you
unless you have questions now. Great.
All right, we'll break and then start at 11:30.
Thank you, Mike.
Sorry.
You have given us a very information-packed presentation. Probably like others, I wrote notes, and then discovered later in the presentation you tended to answer some of the things that I had questions about. I was curious, just to kick off the questions, what was the base foundation of the organization? And what did you grow to next? And what was that environment? And I thought you did a very nice job of laying that out. But is there, what's the last initiative that your group has recently taken on, and why?
Well, that's the issue that's sort of right in front of us right here now is the role that we want to play as local governments in thinking about the future of our regional economy. I don't think there's anybody here who wouldn't agree that the most important challenge facing metropolitan areas of America is what they're going to sell. What role are they going to play in a new economic order that's global and driven by innovation and driven by human talent? And so we, for the last 3 months, have been talking in our board meetings, what is our role? Traditionally, local governments have been focused a lot on the part of economic development that has to do with place, infrastructure, roads, real estate, a lot on policy, tax policy, labor policy, regulatory policy. And that's been sort of the conversation that most local governments have been involved in when it comes to economic development. And that reality is shifted. That's still an important thing to do, but it's not a sufficient thing to do to position economies to be competitive in the long haul. And so we are having the conversation about how to move forward. We just issued a report on Friday that was done in cooperation with the Brookings Institution that sort of communicated to our community that while we have a very stable, growing economy, there are some foundational cracks that we have to address in our ability to stay competitive and to stay relevant and to develop sectors that really are going to drive our economic growth. And so how we got, and so it's an interesting moment. In fact, we're working with a couple of the organizations I mentioned, the Chamber of Commerce, the Regional Development Organization, and the Regional CEO Organization, to think about undertaking sort of a full metropolitan business planning process, sort of coming up with the key strategies that we want to align our respective efforts around this broad community, what sectors, what capital, and so forth. And so how we got to this place, though, to return to the first, is it wasn't sort of open. And this is probably a story that's similar in a lot of our work, where sort of one capacity leads to another role over time. We, as you do here, do the land use forecasting that undergirds our transportation planning work. And that forecasting is done through the use of a model of the regional economy. And so we have some economists, and we have developed over time and had some good professional support there that model that regional economy and as a result have the ability to comment and provide information and analysis about the performance of the regional economy, not just about how we're going to grow. And over time, that information has been viewed as a credible, objective piece of work that the community can rely on. And so for instance, for 20 years now, the Chamber of Commerce every fall puts together one of those chamber-like events where 800 of your best friends come together for breakfast, and they talk about the forecast of the regional economy. They have a keynote speaker, and they always have a report of our analysis of the next year's economic performance, job growth, inflation, GDP, those kind of metrics of growth. And so that then, coupled with our role around convening, we began working on some workforce development issues. Began with the Bush-era WIRE grant. I don't know if you remember those regional workforce innovation grants. We were asked to be a fiscal agent for that by one of our sister organizations who put together the application, filed the application, but didn't want to process federal money. And we're just fine about processing federal money. And so we took on the role of fiscal agent. That morphed into a role of convening all of the workforce organizations, the community colleges, the educational intermediaries. And then that turned into some work that was around what we call the Workforce Intelligence Network, that has created a mechanism for us to work with employers to identify what their needs are in the workforce, and then to develop curriculum and certification programs and other things that are driven by the market demand for those employees. And so so then that workforce stuff has continued to grow to the point that we've just been given a grant from the Lumina Foundation to coordinate a college attainment strategy for the metropolitan area. Now, all of this sounds like sort of big, massive work that must have an army of people behind every one of these ideas, and typically it's not. Typically it's one or two really capable staff people who are focused in on that and maybe a couple of other things, and they are bringing together players who are collaboratively deciding how to move forward and how to create something and what they want to do together. And so a lot of the initiatives that I went through are really undergirded by a pretty small team of professional staff that are housed in our organization, and the thinking of the work comes from the constituency we organize. So that sort of historic role of forecasting the economy, that role of convening, and then I think the third thing that has come along is there's just a fatigue over what we refer to as our border war. And that is this process by which we throw hundreds of millions of dollars at companies simply to move their offices or their production capabilities a few miles across the state line. I mean, this is an absurd sort of public policy. We've always had this tension around economic development within our region, but it's always been manageable with local incentives, which at the end of the day, the pockets aren't all that deep. But the state governments got involved, and they pretty much make it for the asking. If you move a job, you can get 95% of your state taxes returned to you. So your employees all pay taxes to the states. They return almost all of it back to you as an employer, and sometimes that's a single person, which is millions of dollars. And so we, AMC Theaters is headquartered in Kansas City, and they were downtown since they began 40 years ago, and they got $48 million to move 6 miles across the state line, and essentially built a village. And so then, Missouri reciprocates, and so I think the last time I'm off on a tangent. Usually I'm neutral about this stuff, but I'm a couple hundred miles from home. And I mean, I think the last I heard, I forget the exact number, but Kansas had spent $250 million, and they got about 3,000 jobs to move from Missouri to Kansas, and Missouri had spent about just a little under that, just under $200 million, and they got about 2,800 jobs to move to Kansas. And so I think Kansas is up 400 jobs last night at a cost. Now this is what I'll get you at a cost of $300,000 a job. Wow. And so this is how you guys are all. This is our board meeting, and so it comes out when we're talking about this question: what do we need to do to propel our regional economy forward? And the board starts dumping on this. We need to solve this problem. If anybody can solve the problem, we need to solve it. So we'll have the board meeting and resolve. I said, great, I'll put together some information. So within a month, we kind of put all this stuff together and gave them this score sheet, and they started looking about who got what and how much they got and who got it. And they start, they see how much they're part of the problem and why they took that deal, because you can't say no to AMC that wants to build a new building in your city. Nobody can say no to that, and especially if the state's going to pay for it. And so it was kind of this is harder. Why don't we focus our attention not so much on what we find out, what divides us. Let's focus on what unites us. And so it was then that we began talking about these sort of longer-term strategic issues. And at the same time, we were doing this work with Brookings, and it began to culminate and has begun to be influential in informing other regions about these issues to the point that we're now conceptualizing how we can move forward on a way to drive an alternative narrative to this border war problem, and also to drive some real value-added strategy to our regional economy. And so that's a long-winded answer, but I think why I wanted to go through it was, I think is where we are as an agency, is that we have done a really good job of putting together all that stuff I blew through, these various regional cooperative service initiatives, and we have a really good civic infrastructure, but we really need to develop the capacity to align ourselves around the big bets and the strategic investments, and one of those is the structure of our economy. So I think that I'm hopeful that we can use this capacity that we've built to bring some more strategic leadership to the region. And
David,
yeah.
You've outlined some of the problems being on a border, and as you point out, I grew up, a mile, less than a mile from the border. It was just like 8th Street in East Sacramento. That one side is Missouri, the other side is Kansas. Now, there is actually a river between the downtown Kansas City and Kansas City, Missouri, so it's kind of like West Sacramento, to imagine different states. On the other hand, you probably use that to your advantage in terms of getting transportation funding, I'm guessing, because what you probably think of as a traffic jam, we would laugh at here. And I mean, you can go, they have beltways around beltways, freeways going everywhere. You know, what people think is a holdup, I don't know. Your congestion there doesn't seem to be a real problem. So I assume you've been able to get a lot of federal support for your so do you even have transportation issues other than, as far as congestion is concerned?
Yeah.
You know, I guess there's no one from the federal government here.
Yeah, when I'm at home,
Oh, it's New Jersey.
That's where the congestion.
when I'm at home, the official line is, the state line is an asset because it gives us four senators. And,
Yeah.
Since I'm not at home, it's a big flat hassle. It makes everything twice as hard, and including the politics. Having said that, we do unify across the state line around some of those common investments. Transportation is one that we've historically been able to unify around. And so one of the reasons why we have more freeway miles per capita than any metropolitan area in America is precisely that. It's been sort of all growth is good growth mentality that fueled so much of America for so long, and access to federal money and the well-organized state leaders and federal leaders that went after it that give us the higher. Having said that, it's a huge impediment when it comes to building a public transit system because we can't find the financial logic and the priority that's shifting a little bit, shifting a lot actually, but we haven't built the transit system because nobody can wake up on the same day and agree to fund it. They all attach different priorities to it. The city likes it.
So you're smart. So your ability to try to drive smart growth the way we talk about, at least here, being more pedestrian, transit oriented, I guess is a tougher challenge because people can get around so easily.
It's changed remarkably in the last 5 years, and I frankly will credit some of the work that's occurred out of our offices that's helped create tools and models for communities, whether they're suburban, older, urban, to understand that the form of growth is a critical question.
So it's loss of farmland?
Loss of farmland is a bit of a dynamic. I think it's largely driven by market dynamics. You know, we just did a housing study, I'm sure it's no different here, that the growth in our housing market, the entire amount of the housing market growth in our region for the next 20 years will be from people who want to downsize. They're going to be older, or they're going to be younger, they're going to be immigrants, and the rest of the market is flat. And so I think that reality and the fact that we've been able to do that and talk about those issues is driving different sensibility. And then we've worked a lot on, we tend not to use the word growth management in our region, or we tend to use things like placemaking or quality places or even sustainable places, although now we can't use that word, I guess. But you know, for instance, one of our strategies when we think about process is that we're very intentional about how we frame an issue so that it helps bring people together rather than keeps people from showing up. And so 15 years ago, there was a lot of interest, a lot of concern about growth management, but nobody wanted to come down and talk about how to manage, you know, and there was no appetite for that. But what they were interested in was urban design issues. They were very interested in making downtowns viable again, or very interested in creating neighborhoods, and very interested in trails. And so we started talking about quality places, and talked about placemaking. And it's been that conversation of placemaking, coupled with our transportation strategy, that has then begun to create a regional land use framework. It's not a restriction on growth, but is a magnet for growth in activity centers and along corridors. To the point that when we last did our long-range transportation plan 4 years ago, we went through a big scenario process. That wasn't like it's the state of the art. And we showed a map that says, with consequences, if we do what we're going to do in the next 20 years, this is what's going to happen. And virtually, I mean, every square inch of the region is filled up. We were able to articulate that even though a region for 2 million people, we're planning for a region for 5 million people, which is not going to happen at a 1% growth rate. And we were able to articulate the infrastructure costs and sort of the consequences of that. And we put out an alternative scenario that said, if we got 40% of the new growth to go to places that already exist, in older suburbs and urban areas along key corridors, what would the consequences be? And it was huge. I mean, just huge, the dramatic difference. And what we ended up with was, frankly, a loud conversation. It was a hard conversation. But we kind of worked it through and worked it through and worked it through. And ultimately, we adopted a strategy that has very clear objectives, and we are now planning for a region that's going to get 20%, not 40%, but 20% of our growth, new growth, will be aimed at existing areas. And just doing that, we save 25% of infrastructure costs, and we halt the decline in the core of the region, and we save 42% of the land that would have been absorbed otherwise. And so it has a huge impact. And so we've been able to have those kind of conversations, and those have in turn, I think, influenced the discussion. But it's never about managing growth, and it's never about growth restrictions, and it's never about consumer policy. At the end of the day, tax base from the south. The market shifting, we've developed alternative strategies, and I think that has enabled us to make a lot of progress in the last few years. But it still is a hard thing for our program.
It might help my colleagues to understand the political dynamics are there's some similarities, in the suburban communities are redder and the urban blue, but even Missouri has become more of a red state, I guess occasionally purple, but Kansas on the other hand, that makes Placer County look very liberal. So it's not necessarily Overland Park where you have more affluent, but the state as a whole. So when you talk, there's something probably to learn about that, because the way you're describing how to frame issues, we run into that here too, where not everybody, obviously in all our jurisdictions, like to use the same terminology or thought process on why you're trying to promote blueprint and so on.
The other thing that we did that was really helpful in our planning process is we took the comprehensive plan of every jurisdiction in the region. Not every one of them has it, but most do. And we methodically sort of went through and tried to identify what is every town trying to do. And there was enormous commonality. Enormous. I mean, they were all trying to build centers. First suburbs were trying to build centers. Older places were trying to build up their historic downtowns. And they were all trying to build more walkable places. They were all trying to build towns. There were some things that were in common. And then there were some things that were outright inconsistencies. And so part of what we were able to do is say, if everybody does what they're striving to do, there's a lot of possibility of coming together. And also some edges that we've got to deal with. And it's been, that I think was a useful political platform in that we didn't come up with the vision. The vision came out of every town hall, and we began putting them together to try to articulate a coherent sense of direction and figure out what we all need to be doing together so that our individual visions can be achieved and we can add up to something greater than ourselves.
I have a question. Aside from these incentives, are the tax structures very different between the two states?
Well, they're both low tax states by almost any measure. Income tax considerations are a little better on the Kansas side. It's shifting both. I mean, right now we sort of have in both of our state houses, it's kind of the prevailing message is fewer taxes, lower taxes, and that will free up resources that will fuel growth. And so Kansas in particular has put itself on a path of doing away with the state income tax, but historically it's been just slightly lower. The sales tax is actually higher on the Kansas side than on the Missouri side, although not by much. And property taxes tend to be higher on the Kansas side because there's more affluence and they're more dependent on property tax revenues at the local level than in Missouri, where they tend to rely. So I would say taxes are probably historically the biggest issues. Used to be sort of right to work differences. Sort of labor environments fueled a lot, but the labor market has changed to the point that I don't think that is driving vocational decisions as much as it is.
Go ahead.
So, first of all, very impressed with your presentation and the breadth of your agency. So, one of the things that I will take away is that sort of your story of Mark of being sort of success begets success. It was sort of a flywheel. You started in some areas, grew trust, and you essentially more and more cities, counties, leaders were drawn to you to be able to provide those backbone services of very different natures. So if that's the case, then do you subscribe, or what degree, maybe is the right question, do you subscribe to the Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institute's view that the federal government is going to get even more balled up, blocked, and incapable of sort of providing some really clear leadership, and that this is only going to accelerate the need for regional agencies like yours to furnish that leadership in the absence of where you might otherwise get it?
I think Bruce's work is good work, and I think it's generally moving in the right direction. I think his view of the diminishment of the federal government is probably a little starker, a little more complete than I would say. I'd sort of move a little bit next step a little bit. I think the federal government will always be important. There will always be setting the tone. Even when the federal government puts out little money, we all respond to it in really amazing ways. And I think that there will be some realities over time about our economic performance as a nation that will begin to drive and influence public policy. Having said that, I think he's right to the extent that I think the federal government is an unreliable partner. There isn't coherent policy, and it floats from administration to administration. Timing of it is off. And so I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but it's also not as reliable. And so, yes, we need to build the capacity within our regions to provide strategic leadership. And I think we all are grappling with that. That's what we're trying to do. I think from a very practical point of view, as an agency director, it's harder because we have been so successful in putting down federal resources as a unifying mechanism, as well as a practical funding mechanism. Do several of the pieces of work that I mentioned, and the implosion of those resources and unreliability has made our management problem much higher, and it's been a much more stressful couple of years to operate because the resources are harder to determine. So we have to sort of look within ourselves as a region for how do we pay for this work that we're helping to coordinate, and that's a harder, slower process. But it's making progress. I mean, for instance, we've done this really remarkable job of putting together a regional response system that didn't exist at all as a result of Homeland Security money. And part of our success is that we set the principles for that process before the first dime showed. And so public safety community came together, and this is another thing to keep in mind about process. Sort of articulate the principles of agreement on the front end before you talk about the solutions. And so we set 3 or 4 core principles around interdisciplinary and all hazards and shared resources, sort of core operating principles. And we then got $70 million over 10 years and spent it in this incredibly strategic way without a single argument, and which was still amazes me. And have built up this response system. Well, the federal money, we sort of, I think, are the 29th largest metro area in the region, so we fell off the risk list for Homeland Security. And the federal money sort of just dried up overnight. And so we now, the Homeland Security folks sit around the table and say, how are we going to keep this going? We've got to figure out how to keep this core capacity going. So we've worked over the last year, and we've developed a plan where the local governments have all agreed. They concocted it to pass the hat and raise a few $100,000 a year so that we can keep some core capacity and do the essential planning and coordination. And we'll grow and we'll surge if money comes through the federal government. But we will at least keep together the core ability to keep the glue of the system intact. And that came from them, And so that's a slow process. It takes time. So as a management problem, it's gotten it's gotten more difficult. I answered a couple of questions you didn't ask, but it's what I have to wake up and think about.
Scott?
Okay. All right, fine. Quick, I'll be quick. You just started touching on what actually made me curious under the safety and preparedness efforts. Regional 911 system and the interoperable communication. Public safety jurisdictions or public safety agencies tend to protect their turf a great deal, and I'm just curious, how and to what depth is this? Communication systems, you're dealing with technology regionally that they all talk to one another, spending a little more wisely than maybe we do here in this region. I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, actually, I think the fire guys are really collaborative. The police guys do not be so collaborative.
They'll disagree, yeah.
Exactly. School districts don't collaborate at all. That's a whole other story, but we don't do so much with them. It's real. I mean, it's not. And how deep is it? For instance, we got agreement that one of our principles is that all of this federal money, if you buy it, you share it. So if you get any federal money, you got to share it. And so we were able, using that principle of shared capacity, to over time, have 5 hazardous material units around the region instead of what would have probably happened when we would have 20. And we've been able to have 2 urban search and rescue units, and we've been able to have, I forget the numbers, but these very specialized tactical teams are placed in the larger departments, and there's agreement, and they follow through on those agreements to use them when there's an incident that requires them.
In more specific, like the technology side of things, we tend to spend, each jurisdiction spend a lot of money on technology that doesn't talk to one another.
Yeah, and so we have put together what we refer to as a network of networks. And and so the major jurisdictions have developed a system, and we've coordinated the tower analysis and the communications and the different banding technical decisions that have to go into that. And so one of our major suburban counties, Johnson County, which has a lot of sort of county-wide functions, runs the radio system for Johnson County and a couple of outlying jurisdictions. And they connect into that system. Kansas City, Missouri has one, and they connect with several of the Missouri side jurisdictions. Independence, another major jurisdiction, has one, and they take the eastern side of the county. And the state of Kansas has one, and they take some of our outlying areas. And then we have developed the methodology so that all of those systems talk with one another. And so we now have true interoperability across the metropolitan area where you can talk to anybody across the metropolitan area. What is proving to be very expensive and an impediment for local governments is buying the equipment that ends up in the cars. And that's been a very, very expensive process. I also will say that system then is morphing with the technology behind the 911 system, which is going away from wires to wireless. And so we're able to use many of the same towers and many of the same technological elements to move data through the 911 system. And 70% of our 2 million calls comes from wireless devices. And now we're moving to texting 911 calls and such. And all of that plays off of the same technology that undergirds the radio system.
David, one of the things that, I'm sorry, was I out of line here? Okay.
I think she's ready.
I'll go ahead and write it down so I don't forget.
All right. I'm really interested in.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm really interested in the work of the First Suburbs Coalition that you guys started some time ago, and I know several of the members, including Laura McConnell.
Yeah.
Serves with me at the National League of Cities. From your perspective, have you seen, and I think we in this region sort of have an understanding of this situation. We've probably got 90% of the Sacramento region living in a suburban condition. You can talk about first-tier suburbs, but frankly, the issues span all of us. It's just to varying degree, more acute in older first-tier suburbs. Can you give us any idea of sort of successes that you've had over time, or what you see as the future challenges facing that particular group and what you guys are doing about it?
Yeah, we have a series of smaller suburban communities that circle the older urban core, if you will, that spans the state line, most of which kind of came into their own during the late 50s and 60s. Some of which have high pockets of affluence, and many of which, however, have kind of more modest homes that don't have either the sort of architectural quality of the historic homes, but don't have any of the amenities.
Right. So it's the declining real estate value is declining
It's
incomes.
Netherlands of the 2-bedroom, 1-bath,
Yeah.
hallway kitchen kind of starter home that we built a lot of in America, and we have complete communities that are characterized by that kind of housing stock. And their commercial districts increasingly suffer from competition for outlying or larger or big boxes or other kinds of retail strategies. So this really came out of the mayors. It was a mayor in Roland Park, Kansas, who had learned, started to be influenced. I think we actually brought in some folks to talk about those issues, and they were sort of interested. And so they asked us to form an alliance, to form a coalition to help them get started. And from day one, it's been driven by mayors and city managers from about 19 communities that comprise our first urban community. Now, Kansas City has, as you'll recall, has a big swath of its.
Where I grew up would be.
Right, and so the councilmen from those districts, even though all of Kansas City is much more diverse than that, and likewise with independents, and so we get participation. But I would say the fuel is from the smaller jurisdictions of 10 to 12,000 population who are older. So we, early on it just was a matter of what are the issues, what do we have in common, what should we be concerned about. And then over time, they have produced a number of things that have been really valuable. Their most visible early win was an idea book, where we worked cooperatively. We were a team of architects, and they went in and they created this really amazing, colorful, big book about how you invest in one of these homes and update it. Sometimes people don't want to move, they just want a second bath, or sometimes they don't want to move, they just want a garage. And so how you can invest in it. So there were several sort of floor plans, literally floor plans. And we put them in bookstores, and we took them to the home shows, and I think we gave away 20,000 of these books in a year. And they were really popular. And so that then, they moved on, and they decided to do a green idea book. And so they began investing in it was a similar sort of thing about how you can make a home more energy efficient in practical ways that a homeowner can manage. And that had equal sort of response. Along the way, we helped broker an agreement with the Savings and Loan Bank, and they put together a special loan program, a low-interest loan for home improvements in these communities. And we helped to cooperatively market it. Again, we went to home shows, and we put it in community centers, and we sent out their newsletters, and that was a very successful. I think we went through a $3 million line of credit, and then they were on the second one. So it's not earth-changing, but nonetheless, they're able to kind of go back and present an option to a homeowner and encourage them to invest. We've done a couple of commercial plans for 2 or 3 of the jurisdictions, and they did them cooperatively. We developed a partnership with the university design people who kind of went into their communities and developed alternative visions for their commercial districts and historic or their older downtowns. Probably the most significant body of work is that we cooperatively submitted a grant during the Recovery Act to do a first suburban mortgage foreclosure initiative, because none of these cities have staff capacity to handle mortgage foreclosure issues. And so we put together a system, we brought in the expertise, and I forget the numbers on it, but we were able to purchase, rehab, and resell some 100 homes that were across these participating jurisdictions. We're now working with them as the lead on our solar work. We're doing a lot of work around introducing energy codes and solar initiatives in local communities. And so some of it is where we can find resources, some of it's where they're interested, some of it's trying to speak to the need. But again, it sort of follows those principles that I talked about earlier, being locally driven, relevant to the people at the table. It's got to have a business plan behind it, and it's it's overseeing kind of supporting what it is they're trying to get in the other community.
So do you think anything's actually moved the dial, or is it just nipping at the edges?
What has moved? Yes, what has moved the dial is what I didn't even really mention. But what has moved the dial is the sophistication of the local leadership understand that they need to more proactively. So now today, Gladstone, Missouri, which is a kind of a sleepy hollow of most has some 5-story market rate.
Oil shale.
Yeah. It's the NASCAR parade.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Is that what it is?
It is, yeah, for the Sonoma Grand or whatever race.
So it's something about the rail thing we were talking about?
NASCAR.
You don't need to duck and cover.
right.
We don't let them in.
Yes.
I was just going to say, welcome to Cold Bend.
So what's changed, I think, in a meaningful way is local perceptions and their resolve to create downtowns and new urbanist places. So there's 2 or 3, including Laura McConwell's community mission that has developed a strategic. I mean, they've got a high-rise apartment building and commercial center and a sort of a midtown, large-scale redevelopment initiative underway. And that would not have happened were it not for their ability to be thinking about this kind of Gladstone similarly. And then the other thing that's shifted are the demographics are shifted. And so there's a real desire and an intentionality that the communities either need to get smarter. This sounds like Kansas City. So sounds like 3 in the morning.
It sounds
NASCAR with horns.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yeah.
So for our region, we deal a lot with the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA in regards to land use because of levee issues. Can you tell me a little bit about how extreme weather is affecting your area and what kind of conversations do you have around your table about that?
That's a great question. The extreme weather issues largely express themselves in high volume of water streams. So flooding would be the most frequent issue that we see. And we have played a role, particularly with smaller communities, in the interface with federal agencies and assistance or new mitigation plans or the other things that are part of that response system. The other piece that we've been involved in is things like tornadoes and ice storms and grandmother has been expressly supported by an emergency response system that we're talking about earlier. I would say that most of our work has been around flood response and assistance to some degree of mitigation and around emergency response. I would say that our conversations around dealing proactively with resilience in the face of climate change and how we plan and think about that is talked about occasionally by some of our environmental community, but we have not put that emphasis on it as an agency. And there are lots of groups in town that are concerned themselves. We have hosted some speakers on it, we've had some forums on it, but it is not a policy issue that our board is grappling with. We have sort of, I was telling my class that we have sort of a long-range schedule of some policy issues we're trying to address, and this issue of the role we want to, the next phase of our environmental work is what we've been grappling with also, it may come forward. But as you know, I mean, we're we're like everywhere in America, where you can't seem to have sort of a straightforward conversation about that. We can find a middle ground. So that's something we're going to have to give some thought to.
Well, that's why I said it's extreme weather instead of climate change, because that seems to draw a negative thought.
Right, and it does. And for him, so we have that same dynamic in our community where that issue has become polarizing. And the extreme weather events are real. And I can't say we're doing much in the way of planning for them, but we're doing reasonable and having a coordinated response to them.
And the way we look at it here, at least I do, is that the federal government is determining policy because of extreme weather, and that has a direct impact on the land use decisions that we make here on a local level. We have to be part of the conversation in regards to those policies that are set.
Right.
Isn't most of your region protected at a much higher level, at least on the flood issue? Isn't most of Tennessee protected at a 400 or 500-year level?
Yeah, I mean, and so when the flooding events occur.
This is a trick question, by the way. What it really means is you don't need any more federal money.
Yeah. We're still trying to get to that.
I should have spelled that out. I should have done with these meetings. Well, we're going to take every dime we need to manage this.
We're going to force that.
I would say our fundamental our fundamental core issue is the Missouri River management. It's sort of the lifeblood, and we have these kind of historic upstream, downstream wars about irrigation uses versus barging versus environmental issues, and it is. I mean, talk about bad process. I mean, that whole conversation with the Corps managers is an example of bad process. There is no process of approach in any way that makes sense, and so we end up just fighting. So, that's our biggest issue around water, and most of the flooding that happens then is a result of the Missouri River not behaving. And so it's the places that are close to it, you're right, that tend to get most impact. Yeah.
I just have one more question for me anyway. So you know us. You've come to sort of appreciate, you've done your homework. What advice would you have for us as we think about ourselves economically, environmentally, planning for the future, where we are in this current economic phase, this current political phase? What should Sacramento, that is the greater Sacramento region, be thinking about and planning for?
Right, let me answer that two ways. One is, what should Greater Sacramento be thinking about? I think that the fundamental gap in most American metropolitan areas is their economic strategy. I think the economic rationale for America is rooted in its metropolitan areas, and many of our metropolitan areas are not at all poised to be relevant in the next 20 years. And that, I think, is that wealth creation, that ability to have a vibrant community, undergirds our ability to do everything else. It undergirds our ability to invest in infrastructure, to invest in schools, to create the kind of places we all want to be in. And I think we are not sort of there. And so I think that somewhere that should be, and SACOG as an institution can't single-handedly lead that. But SACOG as an institution and the local governments in particular are critical to addressing that issue. We cannot build a regional economy in which the local governments that are on the same page as corporate leaders and as state governments and others. And so this agency, I think, has a unique position in talking about those issues. And so my advice to you as an agency, and this may or may not be apt, but from a distance, you have sort of, first of all, I have to tell you, I was really impressed by that conversation around the rail issue. To a person, everybody who spoke was knowledgeable, on point, articulate. I mean, this is a high capacity board, just from one conversation. And since I'm not being taped, I'll tell you, it's a higher capacity board than the one that I would put. I mean, just uniformly to
we edit the tape, don't worry.
It is. And
don't worry, it's streaming live.
There we go. Yeah. Well, I am going to see my mom. Anyway, I mean, you guys are really good, and you're supported by a staff that is as good as it gets. And I'm sorry to tell you that this is a good. I mean, you guys are. I mean, these guys are really, really sharp, and I've interacted with a number of them, and you know, I mean, Mike is well regarded, and so part of my message to you would be sort of have confidence in your staff, in the role that this institution would play as a leadership organization, and you can't solve everything, but you certainly can be a point of leadership, a point of energy to help drive the community forward. And I think you've got everything you need to sort of exert this really incredible foundation that you've got here to make a big difference. If that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Can I, Chair Roman, just prompt David? There's a set of issues around shared services that I know you're involved in and haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Could we spend a few minutes on that? Because that's what this group used to be called, the shared services.
Right. Well, you know, I've talked already about some of the things that you would call shared services. There's sort of a fine line between a regional service and a shared service. And I don't know that the difference is all that important, because essentially what you're trying to say is there are things we need to do together because we do them better, and we do them smarter, and we do them cheaper. And I would say that just sort of generally, that councils of governments have a unique role to play. They're uniquely suited to fill that void, because this organization, unlike any other, has the ability to achieve those things that I mentioned earlier. It's driven by local governments. You lead it, you support it, you drive the agenda here. It can be responsive to what you need. It's adaptable. You can plug in or out. So you, unlike a private entity or a chamber of commerce, you are institutionally designed to be able to deliver and to fill that space around shared services. And so we have kind of everything from 911 to our Operation Greenlight. We have a cooperative purchasing program. We have begun to develop a national partnership. We just now are working with a group that was formed by ICMA, the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and Council of State Governments, called the Institute for Building Technology Services. It's a not-for-profit organization, and they provide building services, building inspections, floodplain inspections, construction management, whatever you need. And so we are now creating a vehicle to bring that service through us, because it's easy for a local government to contract with us without bidding out and to pull down from it. So it's really been helpful for local communities and for surge capacity for larger communities. You have a big commercial project, they don't want to hire 3 building inspectors, so they can buy down those services and sort of quickly get some services and then return to their core staff. And so it's just kind of a thing. So I think there are some national partnerships that we're working. I also would say that another conversation that we're having is trying to develop some relationships across regional councils where we have mutual interests, where we can build some capacity, share our information, share our technologies, and build some mutual capacity that's valuable. Coming out of the HUD grant that you were involved in, Austin, Salt Lake, and Kansas City all developed some technology-assisted planning tools, some visualization and economic analytical tools to drive sustainable development. And it uses the very same technology, and it mirrors SACOG's, which uses a very parallel technology by 2 vendors. And so we've been involved in this conversation about how can we take this technology, find a national platform to nurture and disseminate that technology, and we can focus on populating it with data and processes that are relevant to our own regions rather than being technology developers. And we can make it better and smarter and more accessible. And I think we have a lot of opportunity to do those kinds of partnerships across the country. We wrote a grant to the Department of Energy that engages our National Association of Regional Councils and 9 other regions to share best practices and to implement solar adoption strategies. And one of the big impediments to solar adoptions in a lot of America, I don't know if it's true in California, has been local land use regulations and local permitting, and the cost of local reviews makes it a more prohibitive venture for commercialization, as well as some financing issues. And so we've developed a number of tools and strategies. We're now promulgating them across 9 regional councils across the country. So I think we have the ability to share across regions as well as to share within our region. And given the lateness of the hour, I want to sort of kind of cover this sweep of it rather than give you more examples of some of the things we're doing. Does that help?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I know you all got one eye on the clock, and I really appreciate your time. I learned as much as I contribute in these kind of events, and this has been really a
an insight for me as well to learn more about the inside of this organization. So thanks for your time.
We thank you.
Thank you.